Thank you for coming, everybody. I'm Ray Gastel, Director of the City Planning Department, and we really appreciate you all being here tonight. I want to note that what we're working on tonight and seeking inspiration, guidance, etc., is on the sort of how we take public engagement for long-range planning, and in particular for a comprehensive planning effort which we are working on. To do that, we have a couple of key tools. One, we learn from the people that have worked here for years in community, and we learn from them. Two, we learn from the processes over the past few years that we've done, ranging from deliberative democracy initiatives and budgeting and an affordable housing task force to any other number of our neighborhood planning work and other approaches we've had of different types of meetings, outreach, etc. We've tried a variety of public engagement, and we continue to do so, and as part of that, we feel it's critical to build both our knowledge and also create a framework for how we go forward with public engagement. So let me explain that a little bit to you. One aspect of this is the speakers tonight, who bring to us some extraordinary best practices and experiences from a range of cities around the country. And you'll be hearing more about them from Sophie Robeson, who together with Andrew McCrae organized tonight's event. And Sophia and Andrew, could you raise your hands if you're here? Great, thank you. But we also have a public engagement working group, and which is a key. We're taking a bit of national inspiration, but we're going to be working with Pittsburghers on how to create this framework for public engagement and take it through a process which will be a draft and reviewed, and then will really be how we do public engagement going forward in 2019 and beyond. So maybe the folks, if you feel the public engagement working group, if you could sort of wave your hand if you're here. I think really pleased that we've got a wide range of folks, and that we're really looking forward to working with you on this issue. So the relationship to a comprehensive plan, I want to be clear. This city has worked on the building blocks of comprehensive planning for many years. The work that we've done with our resilience plan, the work that we've done with building the work on housing, the work that we've done together on complete streets and as we move forward with mobility. But we still plan to move forward as we go forward with all of that. You know, the P4 work that we did as well, people, planet, place, performance. We're still going to pull it through into a comprehensive planning framework and approach, with especially focusing on the issue that is sort of front and center for so many people here, but housing, mobility, and ultimately community development. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Sophie Robeson to introduce the panelists. Thank you.
We're going to have someone fall before we get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Sophie Robeson. I'm a neighborhood planner with the City of Pittsburgh Department of City Planning. So I'm just going to introduce our panelists. Sorry. We're going to start with Gabriel Halili. He's right here. Gabo is a senior project manager at the Hester Street Collaborative in New York City, and he manages and supports planning and community design projects with partner organizations in New York City and beyond. He manages neighborhood planning processes, designs community engagement materials and tools, facilitates community workshops and meetings, and coordinates with partner organizations for implementation. Trained as an architect and urban planner, Gabo is experienced in many project scales, types, and locations, from work on building development in the Philippines to collaborating with diverse communities. And next to him, we have Julia Lindgren, who is his coworker, also a senior project manager at the Hester Street Collaborative in New York City. There, she works on community-engaged design and development projects that seek to ensure neighborhoods are shaped by the people who live in them. As a trained architect, she believes that design can serve as a catalyst to enhance livability for all communities, particularly those with limited resources. Julia has previously worked in Texas and Philadelphia on community-engaged design efforts relating to public health, recovery, disaster housing, and inclusionary planning. Moving down, we have James Rojas. James is an urban planner, community activist, and artist. As the founder of Place It, he has developed an innovative public engagement and community visioning method that uses art making as its medium. Through this method, he has engaged thousands of people by facilitating over 400 workshops and building over 50 interactive models around the world. from the streets of New York and San Francisco to Mexico, Canada, Europe, and South America. Rojas is also one of the few nationally recognized urban planners to examine U.S. Latino cultural influences on urban design and stability. Next, we have Patrice Carroll. Patrice is a strategic advisor for the City of Seattle, their Office of Planning and Community Development. Patrice was the project manager for Seattle 2035, the update of the city's comprehensive plan. She is currently working with several communities to update design guidelines and develop a community plan for an area surrounding an infill light rail station. Before coming to Seattle, Patrice was a planner in public, private, and nonprofit sectors in Philadelphia, Calgary, and Sydney. And finally, we have Matt Dugan. He's the division manager for the Austin Department of City Planning in Texas. He worked on the staff team to create Imagine Austin, the city's first comprehensive plan in 30 years, and is now working on implementing it. He takes a comprehensive approach to developing plans and codes by analyzing economic, social, and infrastructure issues regarding the built environment and natural resources, and believes in utilizing a participatory planning process. I'm going to hand it back over to Ray.
I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that Councilwoman Harris is with us this evening. Thank you for being here, who represents this area and who has been involved in community engagement and public engagement for more than 45 years, I believe is how you described it. I'm just repeating. Just repeating. And then also, we're fortunate to have so many of you here tonight that have served on so many committees and on so many parts of the city. And so with that, I think it's time to turn it over to the speakers. Did you have a few notes?
Yeah, so to start off, just so everyone knows the plan for the evening, each panelist is going to give a presentation of approximately 5 minutes. It's going to give kind of an overview of their work. And then we're going to have some kind of moderated question and answer session, and we'll also have an open mic so the audience can ask any questions that they'd like as well. And we're going to wrap up by somewhere between 8:45 and 8:50, and then hopefully everybody can go home by 9. So that's the plan for the night, okay?
Sure. So hi, I'm Patrice Carroll. I'm here from Seattle. Thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. I spent many, many years living and working on the other side of the state, so it's great to be back in the Commonwealth and see all these beautiful old brick buildings, which we don't have so many of in Seattle. Seattle 2035 was our comprehensive plan. We are required by our state Growth Management Act to have a comprehensive plan and to do a major update periodically about every 8 years. So we too sat around tables like this and had conversations about what we should do to involve the community. So we did many of the typical things, but I did want to talk about a couple of things that we did that hopefully were different and that you might want to think about here in Pittsburgh. Partnerships. You can't do community involvement without partnerships. And we wanted to have new kinds of partnerships. We wanted to reach new audiences. So this was something that was critical to our thinking. And whether we were in Seattle, we have a lot of people moving to our region, primarily younger people. And how are we going to connect with these people who didn't have a history in Seattle? And so maybe having a big ideas, rapid fire pa-cha-ka-cha session, maybe that was a way that we could reach them. So let's try that. We also, although a lot of the people in Seattle look like me, about a third of our population is communities of color. And we also have a sizable number of immigrants in the city. And so reaching that audience. And so whether we were partnering with Goodwill or with the Africatown Community Development Corporation, building partnerships with organizations like that to reach audiences that we don't typically see at our more normal community outreach events. We also wanted to reach young families because we knew that they were super busy but super vested in the city, and we were unlikely to meet them at meetings. And so partnering with groups who attract young families, and we partnered with the Seattle Art Museum because they had a whole program on Saturday mornings where people could bring their kids for activities and movies. And so while all the kids were coloring, we could, chat with the parents and find out what they were thinking. So we really kind of opened up our thinking about who we could partner with, and particularly in thinking about those particular audiences that we weren't going to see at our more typical meetings. I think it was especially important for us to do that at the beginning of the project. That's the phase when it's really easiest for a lot of people to engage, because you're thinking, and you're just hearing. People feel really comfortable identifying issues, talking about opportunities and aspirations for their community. So that's probably the part of the process where most of the people are going to feel the most comfortable engaging. So can't talk about community involvement these days without talking about technology, and particularly being in such a tech-savvy city as Seattle. And by the way, tech workers, they love planning. It's all like a big network problem to them. So, and the technology really allows us to reach more people, reach those people that meetings don't work for. So we tried a few different platforms during our process. Some were a little more content heavy based on what we were trying to do at that particular time, when we had a lot of technical information that we needed to share with people and get feedback. We also used a tool, so that was kind of like we called it an online open house, and it really replicated sort of the information and kind of collected feedback in a survey format. We also tried more of a dialogue tool. Is there a place where people could have a civil conversation online, and where people might change their minds based on what they learned and based on what other people were saying? So we worked with some researchers at the University of Washington who were developing a platform called Consider It, where we could identify particular questions for the community, proposals, and then they could kind of debate those, and we had a histogram where people could use a slider to say where they were on the spectrum, how much they agreed or disagreed. And although we didn't get super high numbers of people participating, a few hundred people did participate in that, we got very, very rich feedback, because people really were discussing and sort of sharing information and sharing ideas online. So that was a pretty interesting experiment for us, and we went on to use that for another citywide project. We also, not on our project, but on another citywide project, we were experimenting with the HoloLens. And so we built some 3D models, and people could put on these glasses. I don't know, has anybody used a HoloLens yet? And you can kind of look around, and it gives you a three-dimensional view of what things might look like if your land use changed. Works for a particular demographic. You probably know who that is. But it did open up some discussion amongst the staff as they were trying out, and they were like, oh, that really doesn't work. Maybe we need to go back to the drawing board. So it's an interesting tool. I'm not sure how we'll use it in the future, but I think it's something that we'll probably see more and more in planning and design situations. Time to go?
Apparently we're out of time, and apparently I'm the timekeeper. Good to know. Do you have any final words?
And then this last slide just represents branding and graphics. Didn't think about this that much at the beginning of the project, but came to appreciate this much more. So again, having a simple name people could remember, having some really engaging graphics that gave the product and that gave all of our products a consistent look. We got a lot of compliments, and we got a lot of use out of this artwork. We worked with some graphic designers at the beginning of the project.
Great, thank you very much.
Good evening. Matt Dugan, City of Austin. Thanks for having me. So just off the bat, I want to let everybody know, used to live in York, Pennsylvania, on the other side of the state. My father-in-law actually grew up in Tarentum, up by the Greenbelt, and his dad and his grandfather worked for Pittsburgh Plate and Glass I get to coach my son's Little League baseball team, and so each year I let him pick out which team we want to be. So a couple years ago, picked out the Pirates, so thought I'd wear the hat. So although I am from another city, I feel like I should be an expert on Pittsburgh as well. In Austin, our planning history, we had a comp plan in the late 70s, and then there was an effort in the mid 80s to update that. That failed on third and final reading. So the city kind of switched and started doing neighborhood planning. Did that for about 15 or so years, but it wasn't getting us where we wanted to go. So we had a new city manager and our planning commission were, like, where's your comp plan? How do you make decisions if you don't have a comp plan? Where do you know where to go if you don't have a plan to get you there? So we started a process to do Create Imagine Austin. Some lessons learned for us. I felt like this stuff was really hard. It was hard to create the plan. We wanted multiple ways for people to provide input. Most people can't come to a public meeting, and in my opinion, a public meeting it's not a best practice to get input. The only thing worse is a public hearing. Which when you go through a process, it can really frustrate people because you get their input, you take that input, you put it into some sort of draft work product, you take it through the system, the task force says, yes, we like this, checks off on it, and then it gets a planning commission, and they start making some changes for it, and that irritates the task force members, and then it goes to council makes some changes to it, and that irritates planning commission and the task force and the participants. So just sometimes it's a messy process. Okay, so this is what community engagement sometimes looks like in Austin. So you identify the topic, identify your stakeholders, create a task force, do some outreach, get some data, look for the perfect solution because it's out there. Then you complain about outreach in the process. You do more outreach. You trash the data. It doesn't say what you wanted it to say, so you get rid of that and get new data. Then you continue searching for the perfect solution. More meetings, then you develop recommendations, then you ignore those recommendations, then you create a board or commission, and then you start over. This takes a year, 2 years, 3 years, sometimes a lot longer. So we had to break this. We had to get out of this. We did some research on other cities, and the longer they took to create their comp plan, the less successful, the less likely they were to get it adopted. So we had to get a schedule. We had to stay on schedule and get through the process. Otherwise, we knew we wouldn't be able to finish. We wouldn't be successful. And we had a lot of folks telling us throughout the process, you'll never do it. You'll never get it done. You'll never get support for it. It failed in the 80s. It's going to fail again. So we just had to keep going. So that's one of my talking points is stay on schedule. The other would be communicate. When we started the process, I didn't really know what messaging or branding was. I'm a planner. I don't really know how to communicate. So trying to figure out how to come up with messages. Why is this important? What is the comp plan actually? Define it. Why is it important? Why should I care? Why should I participate? And explaining that to folks so they know. And then the other thing we notice is a lot of societies communicated in sound bites. A tweet, a bumper sticker, something like that. So it's hard to communicate complex planning topics in sound bites. It takes a while. You really got to walk people through. You got to educate them. You got to explain the pros and cons. Maybe do some scenario stuff. So it's difficult to communicate these things. The other thing I would say is, for planning, a lot in society, especially with things that it's an either or, either rail or roads, or either affordable housing or preserve the environment, or it's it's kind of in elections, it's like one winner, one loser. So it's this either or mentality, but planning doesn't have to be like that. It's really a both and. To solve our congestion problems, it's not rail or roads. It's rail, roads, and sidewalks, and trails, and bike lanes. It's all those things. So just make sure you're open to that. Being flexible and realizing it's not either or. It's both and. The thing I want to say is expectations. So for us working on this and this knee deep, 8 hours a day, every day. For people in the community, even something like on a planning commission or a task force, they're in this, maybe one day a month for an hour, maybe an hour and a half. So it's just, keep that in mind. It's you you really got to bring them along with you to get where you're going. The stuff makes perfect sense to us, but we're not really normal to a normal person that wouldn't. And somebody told me too, you're not really competing with other city things or other initiatives. You're really competing with Taylor Swift. People have a very limited attention span, and so it's really tough to compete with that. And then the last thing, difficult to communicate, create, and implement. And the last one. And so, so I love this slide. This kid, this is what he wanted for the future of Austin. More lizards. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, but for people, it's like, well, this is what I want. And I think, for me, I've got 3 kids. This is why I plan for the future. And I think about when I was a kid, or when your kid's like, you're just flexible, or you're open, you're adaptable. You can go through crazy amount of change, from a tricycle with 3 wheels to a bicycle with 2 wheels, like nothing. But then the older I get, I realize, like, well, I don't really like change too much. I'm not that open-minded to it. So I just have to kind of keep in mind, like, this is why we're doing stuff. This is why it's important to plan. It's not just about what I want, but what's best for the future of the city, what's best for everybody in the city.
Thank you. So James Rojas is the next.
Hello, my name is James Rojas, and I'm going to be talking about, what do people of color get out of community engagement? Because as a Latino growing up in LA, it's not very well. We didn't get a lot of resources from the city. So I started thinking about planning and how people of color think about planning. So for me, it has to be really kind of transformative, but also it has to really kind of motivate people to kind of take action. Next slide. So the whole idea is that, so how do you understand communities of color? For people of color, it's about their family, their friends, their neighborhoods. A lot of them might not be homeowners, so they don't really think about urban design. So maps aren't really important to them. It's about the stories, the narratives, and uplifting, their social connections in their neighborhood. And what's your sense of belonging here? Why do I belong here? Why am I even here? And how do I keep that sense of belonging? As a way to really understand planning. But also, what are your aspirations? What do you aspire to? What's your future? What's your goal here? And a lot of my work's looking at Latinos living in the U.S. and how they're kind of transforming space and making it their home. So I believe that so we start with the people-based approach, with storytelling, narrative, emotions, all that stuff. Your everyday life is a plan. How do you get to school? How are your children? And then after that comes a brick and mortar. So it really kind of changes the character of planning. Next. So I use tools of inclusion. So that's storytelling, and also using the city's visual, spatial, and emotional language. Because we all share that. We all share the street. We all share the park. We all share the river. So that's our collective language of a city. So using that as an experience, and it brings people together, and it breaks down barriers, and not using maps, numbers, and words. Because maps, numbers, and words are the planner's language. And people in the street don't think that way. They think about, this is a nice street, I'm cold, I'm hot, it's safe, it's dark. That's what I think about the city. And we want to capture these emotional experiences people have, and bring them into the planning process. Because then we'll have a plan that's more rooted in people's experiences and not just some kind of numbers game. So I think, and so also, how do we humanize this process and make it more human? So by shifting the tools of engagement, you shift the outcomes and you shift the power, because now other people have power in the planning process. If it's just maps, whoever we use maps has the power. Next slide. So to humanize the process, what I do is I kind of create a safe, comfortable space, for people to come together. And also make it a collaborative. I tell people, in planning, there's no right or wrong answer. It's about how our ideas impact each other and how can we collaborate. And for a lot of people, for a few folks, that's kind of hard. But I tell them, no, it's about collaboration. Coming together. And how do we meet people where they are? People of color, where they are physically, socially, and mentally. And kind of move into their communities. And also looking at it like as a healing process. How do we heal communities to make people feel that this is going to improve their life? This is going to improve their sense of belonging and also heal their environments. I think because people need a lot of healing because of all the different kind of disruptions happening from global warming and politics and technology. People just want to belong somewhere and want to feel secure about somewhere and haven't think about these kind of things. So for me, it's about building for a planner. It's about building relationships. How do you understand your constituents out there? How do you understand where people come from? How do you understand how a Latino thinks about, public space versus African American about the public space and all these issues that are very cultural and very rich for people and very important? And how do we listen and learn to people? How do we listen to people, and how do we learn from each other as a planning process? Not just from the planner, but each other for our stories. And how do we, change attitudes? We tell our story. People usually build their favorite child memory as the way to start the planning process. But from that process, we learn about each other. We learn our stories. We break down barriers. So we try to start to change attitudes about people. And how do we reframe planning from a very kind of emotional storytelling narrative to brick and mortar, rather than having brick and mortar be the map, be the key, but have the story be the key, and change attitudes and change outcomes, and learn how to collaborate, and really capture every whisper in the room. Next slide. And for the community, how do we enhance social bonds? People want to enhance their community, want to enhance their connection with people in order to plan. And how do we build a planning capacity for some communities? You might be dealing with the immigrant community that's only been here 10 years. And for them, they see the city as the glass half full, and therefore they feel, well, I don't need to be, it's better than where I come from, so I don't really need to belong in planning, but we got to get them engaged in planning. And how do we tap into local knowledge? How's their knowledge and what's been to the table from different parts of the world can really enhance the city of Pittsburgh. And think about, building leadership, but ultimately really kind of motivate people to take planning in their own hands. This is not just a planning business. This is in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're now going to have Gabriel Halili, and is going to be speaking together with Julia Lindgren from the Hester Street organization. So thank you.
So again, I'm Gabriel Halili. This is Julia Lindgren. We're from Hester Street, a collaborative from New York City. So us in Hester Street, we are an urban planning, design, and development nonprofit working to ensure that neighborhoods are shaped by folks who live in them. We provide a lot of technical assistance, really, and capacity building to community-based to community-based organizations, public agencies, private firms on land use processes, neighborhood planning, and public and private community development projects. Our organization is a women-led, majority women, majority minority organization. And we pair our skills as architects, urban planners, organizers, designers, developers, with the folks who we work with, who are really the experts on the ground in the communities they come to. Since we are all outsiders in our organization, we come and partner with folks who actually know what's going on in their communities and lend our expertise, lend our technical expertise with them. So we believe that really stakeholders are at the center of any planning, design, development process. And to make that really meaningful, community engagement has to be the center of that. And around that as well, our goal in our community engagement, as well as our project, is to make sure the folks that we work with know the whole process. We gather information, and why are we gathering information? Why are we taking our time? Where is it going at the end? How is it going to be implemented? And what kind of steps we'll get there to work with other agencies, other organizations, other people in your neighborhood that can help bring this to implementation.
So as Gabo mentioned, we work on projects of a variety of scales, but regardless of those projects, engagement is really at the core. We approach every project, every neighborhood, every community group, understanding that each situation is unique. However, we have kind of harnessed some guiding principles that we like to use in our work, regardless of the communities we're working with. One of those is a collaborative approach. So we recognize, even though we all live in New York, every community is different. I'm certainly not a member of a lot of the communities that we're invited into to do work. So our step one is really deeply engaging and partnering with community organizations that are trusted, have been in the neighborhoods, have connections with the folks and the residents, understand the needs of those residents. So we partner with them to really kind of lead and take a primary role in the engagement work that we do, also providing stipends to, to make sure that everybody is recognized for their time and their commitment. A second is kind of inclusive and targeted engagement. We like to first go in and really prioritize reaching out to the most vulnerable, both geographies and populations up front to make sure that we're targeting those groups. People of color, low-income communities, folks with disabilities, formerly incarcerated, geographies that are removed from transit access. So we really make an intentional shift to make sure that we're getting to those groups. This includes getting out and having meetings or direct conversations or creative engagements at times throughout the day that work for working moms, families with kids. We also do a lot of translation into multiple languages. We provide childcare. We always feed people. So it's just some basic things I really appreciate and recognize that everyone is making a commitment to participate in the engagement process. Another one tenant is kind of asset-based, recognizing the expertise that communities bring to the table, but then also recognizing the expertise that design and planners bring to the table, making sure that the communities are empowered with the knowledge, the language, to be able to engage at the table with decision makers. Ideally, we're shifting that power so there actually are the decision makers at the table in some of these community engagement processes. Creativity is big to us, designer and planners. We like to have fun. I think engagement takes a lot of different forms. I'm sure we'll get into it as the questions go on. And then I think this was touched on earlier, but also making sure that that our work is implementable, so that there is a direct outcome of the work and the expectations are really established up front with the communities that we're working with, so that it's clear what is on the table, what do they have influence over, what do they not have influence over, and so that those expectations are established and everyone kind of has the same vision and goal for whatever the project might be.
Great. Wow. You guys are the most efficient presenters I've ever seen. Some of you are architects, but clearly not overwhelmed by architecture culture in which you would never have made it through at this short a time. Let me ask a couple questions. And we are going to remember, if you've looked at the structure, we have a lot of time for audience questions as well, but I'm just going to sort of get it going a little bit here. We have about 25 minutes before we go to the audience questions. But I wanted to ask, a lot of you mentioned the importance of the local, and I think a lot of you have, it's interesting, you have some practices, which I would, local and global is part of what you do in a way. But what I'm wondering if you could give us, sometimes we call it learning from where you live. And I was wondering if you could give us some concrete examples. Now, we gave you a format in which you had no time to actually give concrete examples of this, but I'm going to ask you in the sort of responding to this, and any number of you will be able to respond. But the way I want to frame the question is, try and remember in a planning process where that intent of learning from where you live led to some things that you, as the kind of planners, whether consultants, whether the city, whatever your role was, would never truly were truly surprised by, in terms of something that came out in the process that wouldn't have been heard without it. And I'm wondering if a couple of you have some ideas about that.
I'll start. For me, when I start my workshops, I have everybody build their favorite child memory to understand the sense of belonging in the city. How do you belong here? It might be doing hair with my grandmother or my mother, or it might be climbing a tree. So that really brings people to a different place, because now they're thinking about how the built environment kind of shapes, kind of nurtures their lives. So that kind of brings people to think about community in a really different way. Because now it's about belonging, nurturing, and sharing based on childhood memory. And that's something that all of us have as adults, as a childhood, and have these memories. And that's a really easy way to get people thinking in a different direction about the future of the city.
Great, thank you. Any other examples? Maybe Patrice, you look ready to go.
Yeah, so as we did our engagement, and particularly with some of the targeted audiences, we have an area in Seattle that's very diverse. It's also the area where we built our first light rail stations. And so when we were having conversations in that community, we were getting a lot of questions about light rail, and why don't we have park and rides? Because we really need park and rides. And again, these are lower income communities who are, trying to access our brand new light rail stations, but can't quite get there. And we were like, yeah, but we're all sustainable. We're not having park and ride, And so that was a little bit of a surprise for us, and really indicated that we needed to kind of double down on some of the transit connections to that light rail network. And so that's learning that we carry forward.
As a policy matter, you actually did allow for some parking, at least on an interim basis. So you did a kind of interim vision in response to that.
Yeah, but
Great.
it was, it was like, that's not exactly what we were thinking we were going to hear from that community.
And you hadn't really heard it in the process. And, yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Gabo and Julia, you mentioned a lot, trusted community partners as a kind of model to make sure that you're hearing folks and so forth. And then I want to combine that with another thing that we've been thinking about. Do you feel that the trusted community organization is your kind of key to being able to have some of the difficult conversations that planning brings out? I mean, there's always really difficult conversations, no matter how you frame it. And some are especially difficult. I wonder if you could give us some examples of some of the more difficult conversations you were part of that partnership helped it actually spirit of trust that allowed it to move forward.
Sure. One that comes to mind for me is we were working with the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, so working in a primarily black neighborhood in eastern Brooklyn. And so in that case, I mean, our partnerships were absolutely crucial. A lot of our conversations and our focus groups were with primarily youth and young adults who had been formerly incarcerated, were still in the criminal justice system. And so working with trusted community organizers and really folks that they already had a strong relationship with, to pull out and to really understand the challenges that they were up against, kind of one way. So, and then I think on the converse side, a lot of our projects are also involving city agencies. So I think it's both also educating the city and educating the folks that are making the plans, and they want to come out and they want to see the engagement process. But in certain instances, before we do that, we also put them through a whole engagement process that could look in the form of like a racial equity training for city staff who are going to be out in these neighborhoods engaging with folks. So multi-pronged, I think, is from both kind of like top down and bottom up.
Did anything to add, Gabo?
I feel like there are difficult conversations, no matter who we partner with, will always happen. I think from the projects I've been in where there are rezonings, which then communities might not necessarily welcome the rezonings, these conversations happen whether or not the city is in the room. And I think key to that conversation is really having a forum for people to actually say what they feel and voice out their frustrations before they can come into actually thinking about the future. With histories of disinvestments in these communities I feel like has to be acknowledged first. Then going forward is not necessarily easier, but easier to think about.
I'm wondering if you, thank you. I'm wondering if whether you or others might answer this question. It's like, one of the tensions sometimes in planning processes is you have two goals which they're not mutually exclusive, but sometimes they're hard to keep going. One is you want to have a core group of people that stay involved along the way, because if you don't have that, then you don't have the continuity with the engagement. Yet at the same time, you want to make sure that you don't become a sort of isolated core group of sort of 12 people and the rest of the other folks don't feel welcome or feel that they've been left out. And given people's time commitments and so forth, everybody can't come to every meeting. But what are some of the ways that you've made sure that you've sort of sustained interest with a large group, yet at the same time you got a core group that makes it every meeting that sort of gives you some continuity as well? Is it technology that helps you that? Is it the message or the way of approaching the problem through a people-based rather than numbers and maps and so forth? What helps you with that of sort of, because ideally, as Matt noted, it doesn't always help to make it a really long process. in which I'd like to talk to Patrice about the length of process in Seattle someday. Where the average process is about 4 years. But that said, I want to know how you do this.
I think for me, it's building that social cohesion. I want everybody to come to a meeting and bond with people. So now you're building a social capacity that people know that they're gonna have friends there, and they're gonna make new friends there and kind of feel that they're wanted there. Especially with refugees, they come to this country, they don't know anybody, but once they build their favorite child memory and tell their story, and everybody else does, then they're in. So now you're building a bigger network of people from all walks of life, and then humanizing the process really kind of brings that out. So now your group gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But you have to humanize it and keeping it kind of on the social, and where people are gaining from knowing people and collaborating. It's a win for them, not a loss. And they're not going there, and they're not going there in a really competitive environment, but a very, very, very collaborative environment. So it really brings it back. It makes the group bigger.
Okay, thank you, Matt.
I was just going to say, I think that's a lot of that has to do with how you design your process. So some folks can be really heavily engaged and go to a public meeting and get really knee deep in the stuff. Other people, you might just be able to get them for 5 minutes. So be able to design the process to accommodate both types of users and input, then be able to do something meaningful with that input, I think helps. The other thing is we didn't just ask people to come to us, we'd actually go to them. So we had what we called a meeting in a box. It was kind of a portable meeting that people could use and do on their own time, wherever they wanted to do it. And then we would also have these traveling teams. So we'd go to places where people were already hanging out, grocery store, a high school football game, the mall, a trailhead, stuff like that. And so those, although not very in-depth, input is you're making awareness of people, you're getting them to fill out a survey, and you're letting them know how they can get further involved if they want to get further involved.
Thanks. So let me ask a couple other questions. I mean, one of the things that is always a challenge in planning is that planning, in comprehensive planning as well, doesn't always come with any guarantees of action. It's the implementation question away, but for planning, part of the implementation is just whether you write new zoning laws or sort of the rules have been rearranged, and that's part of implementation and going from a plan to ordinance and so forth in a classic planning way. But at the same time, when you're doing these comprehensive plans, do you feel that if people need concrete examples of what's going to come out of it? I know, for example, in one of your cities that the sort of neighborhood plans that were done in a sort of comprehensive, many neighborhood plans at once way throughout the city also came with some capital investments, such as libraries and other amenities. But all of you have worked at very different scales with very different things. And just the question what sort of coordination needs to happen so that you're not sort of left creating a plan, but without the backup, whether it's from the city, private sector, civic sector, for a number of follow-through elements. I mean, that's a big question, but you can give concrete examples in response. So I'm going to start with Patrice, since it was kind of a little layup.
Yeah. So our comprehensive plan is what they call statutory. So it means it could actually go through a legal process. If there's something in our comprehensive plan that we say we're going to do and we don't do it, you could take us to court and try and make us do that. So we tend to be a little tentative about what specific projects. Our capital improvement program is included in our comprehensive plan by reference, but I think what we tried to do to make things kind of more real and more tangible for people was to not try and educate them about the hundreds of policies that are in our, very thick comprehensive plan document, but to pick out the ones that were really important, to pick out the directions, to pick out the key proposals where we were making a shift, and then talk about what that shift might mean. Would that shift indicate different ways we might prioritize some of our transportation funding, or the different ways that might affect some of the land use and the zoning that we would have in the future. So that was, and these were all based on priorities that we had sort of gathered from the community. So what were the things that were important to them? and then responding to what actions we would take and where these new policy directions might lead us. So I think that in our sub-area plans, the more specific area planning that we do, we are trying to get more to that list of projects and like lifting up what the city's already doing, what the city's planning to do, and then what are the other kinds of projects that should be on that list.
Great, thank you. James?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, the city of Phoenix built this really beautiful center for people with disabilities, and across the street was a light rail station that didn't stop there. The people with disabilities always public transportation, so a lot of them do. So what I did is I did a workshop 5 years ago where I had all these people come together with disabilities and design their ideal light rail station. They did, and they were so excited. For 5 years, they lobbied the mayor of Phoenix and the transportation department to build a light rail station, a new one to serve them. And they had a lot of pushback, but they finally got it built. And now this year they broke ground for that project. Now they're gonna have the first ADA compliant station in the country. They're just having that vision to move forward with that. The tangible vision is what they wanted.
That's congratulations. Did you folks have any response to this one? Because I know you sometimes work at a different scale than sort of not citywide, not with sort of city authority behind you, but sort of more in a community-based.
Yeah,
what kind of products or implementation comes from that?
Yeah, I think we tend to work in a lot of communities that are starting to feel like they're overplanned. They've done so much planning, and people have gone back to those same communities over and over and over and kind of asked the same questions. And so I think being really intentional about taking kind of like an inventory of where that community is, where the city is, in terms of some of these engagements, and building off of those to further the conversation as opposed to starting at ground zero every time. I think in some of those neighborhoods we've had success when we've linked planning with small implementable projects that they can kind of do in the next 6 months and next year. And so when we take on some of these projects, we will put aside intentionally a pot of money for the community then to decide out of that planning process what is one project that you can implement and do in the next year or so. It's so that it's not just planning, but you're starting to see change in your neighborhood.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to go to the audience. And so, let me. But this is a difficult one for kind of the sort of the, in a sense, a technical question, but not necessarily really. But people actually experience is not really that technical. The question of like what you do and systems. You mentioned, Patrice mentioned that like the tech community loves the network problem of, in a way, they can very attractive planning in those terms. But not everybody is going to respond in those ways. And at the same time, people are working in a system, an open space system, a transportation system. There's very much a sort of system that you can't do this work without some sort of system analytics in which this kind of the community engagement is part of that story, but at the same time there's data and analysis and so forth. And how do you make those questions or the kind of content at the same time without losing people or alienating them in some of the ways that James Rojas mentioned you might if you sort of had too many maps and too many so forth, but how do you at the same time bring people into that discussion in which so it's not as though your sort of systems analysis is happening in another world over here. It is related, and you know that what you're doing in the community is related to larger systemic issues, and those could be economic, but they could also be transportation, they could also be any number, our technology, infrastructure, et cetera. So I realize it's sort of a big question, but that's the point. Is this a difficult one to end on before we open it up? And I would appreciate a response from any of you all.
The systems one's a good one, especially if you can show people how the different systems work. If you can connect those dots, I think it's really effective. For transportation, I've seen people say like, hey, from your walking out your door to your sidewalk, or if you're in a car from your driveway, you can get to your street, which gets to another street, to the interstate, which can take you to wherever. So that whole network is connected. And then what happens if you don't connect to that area? If somebody has to go from here, then all the way around over here just to get back to where something on the other side of that street. So in a network way, I think it's easy to show that stuff. For planning, you're trying to you've got these two tracks. One's your social track, and the other's what I call a technical track. So your social track would be your values, your dreams, your ideals, what you really want, and then the technical track would be the data, the demographics, the topography, the geography, the environmental constraints, those things. And so you're really trying to bring those two tracks together to create something that makes sense to help improve your city.
Thanks. A couple other responses.
I'll just say that connecting the transit systems and our land use system was a really big theme throughout our planning, because we have the worst traffic, some of the worst traffic in the nation, and so that was really top of mind for people. We're very late in building out a rail system, so we are very reliant on a bus system. But it's a really good, and it's a flexible system. But how do we weren't necessarily looking at land use around that bus system. We were kind of focused on light rail stations. So that was a big theme, was because people agreed generally that, yeah, that's the best place to grow, is near where the good transit is. That's like the only way we're going to be able to continue to grow and still maintain our quality of life. So I think people naturally did see a big connection in those systems, and we had a lot of discussion and a lot of debate around that.
Thank you, James.
I think the need is to really kind of personalize the system. Like if we're going to solve transportation or global warming, all the different issues, we have to make it personal. So what I do is that when I start a transportation meeting, I have everybody build their first memory of mobility as a kid. And what did that mean to you? It was independence, it was access, it was curiosity, it was being with my friends. So now they think about the system as all these things, not just from going to A to point B. So now they're more kind of embedded in this whole process of planning. Because now they can personalize this idea. How do you personalize your home or open space, but just have people tell a personal story about what that meant to them as a kid and how that can have all these different kind of impacts. And also for me, using objects as a way to communicate really kind of changes the system of planning. Because for a lot of Latina women, they use their hands to cook, clean, garden, and having the tools to having to use their hands for the meeting really kind of changes the system of planning now. Because now they're using their hands as a communication tool, and they can get more in depth in that kind of knowledge. So really having more kind of different systems.
Great, thank you. Gabo and Julia, would you like to add to that?
I'm hoping this is answering the question. I think around systems and around, I think, technical knowledge, like bridging that gap between technical knowledge and then how to bring lay people to understand these. In our experience, I think a pressing issue really brings people to a place or people invested in their area. And then educating, we've had experience doing like a zoning workshop, which is very technical around like literally R1, R2, R3, all of that, to come to a point where, because they're very invested in their neighborhood, they want to be able to engage with the process as effectively as they can. They learn it. They come to meetings with city planning, knowing what R1 is, looking at an actual zoning map, like this is my neighborhood, I know this is R6, I know that the ability to build here hasn't been maximized yet, so I know developers are coming to build this up. So I feel like that could, thinking about the public as not wanting technical knowledge, it's not necessarily fully true.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I think it's just how to connect. So why don't we actually go to questions now? We're going to, who's going to, do we have someone with a mic? You're going to have a mic. All right, great. And then these folks will be able to respond with this mic. Perfect. So just go ahead and raise your hand, and between Sophia and we'll find you.
So I think is this working? Yeah. So I think we've heard basically two very different stories from different types of cities and different types of engagement. And I think it's really important to contextualize what's happening in Pittsburgh specifically. And to that extent, because Amazon is interested in coming here, I think there's a lot between Seattle and Pittsburgh that is important. And so, okay, thank you. So I guess I want to go a little bit about as far as
we can't hear him. He's standing right here. I can hear him from here, but I don't think they can hear him.
There we go. Did everybody hear me in the back? Should I repeat? Repeat. Okay. So I think a lot of folks out here, I think it's important for us to contextualize what's happening in Pittsburgh. And specifically because of Amazon's interest in coming to Pittsburgh, I think there's a lot of parallels to be made with Seattle. And so I wanted a little bit of audience participation, and I wanted to ask how many people are worried about engagement from lots of white young techies? Lift your hand. So are people wanting to engage more white young techies, or are you more worried about the folks who are being displaced by white young techies? Please lift your hand if that's the case. Okay, cool. So I guess my question specifically, because Seattle is in the middle of a huge housing crisis, is beyond engaging the techies, specific things that you've done to engage the homeless and the folks who are being displaced by the techies.
So we made equity sort of one of the major themes of our comprehensive plan, and so we wanted to go into this planning process really looking through it at an equity lens. So we did quite a few things. We did a lot of internal work. Seattle does have a race and social justice initiative, so all staff, all of our commissions, all go through training, again, to heighten awareness, to bring all of that history and all of that thinking forward. We also specifically worked with Policy Link, which is kind of a think tank organization from the Bay Area, and we invited them to come to Seattle and again, talk to the community. They did a workshop for staff. We had 150 staff, including even some council members who came to this workshop, and they shared with us kind of best practices from around the country and what other people had done in their comprehensive plans. They also held a similar workshop in the community to talk about what kinds of things the community would like to see in the comprehensive plan around equity. What were the issues that were most important to highlight? Also, as part of our engagement, we used a couple of different models to engage a more diverse audience. And again, displacement is a major theme. So we went into specific communities to have conversations about what was happening in those communities. And again, we used a trusted advocate model similar to the one that Hester Street described. So we actually contract with someone in the community who convenes that group and helps us with translation services, and will, again, it's usually a small group, a focus group, so the conversation is very rich, and then they provide the findings from that discussion that then we can integrate into our work. But we also wanted those communities to feel comfortable coming to larger events, because again, when we have a big open house to talk about the draft plan, we don't just want it to be all people who look like me in the room. So what could we do to make more diverse audiences more comfortable, or to make that work for them? And so we, again, relied on some community-based organizations to bring their members to an open house, and then we provided like a guided open house. So a staff person would be assigned to that group. They would walk through the open house, they would pose questions to them, they would sit around a big table and talk about the questions and fill out a survey, and again, provide us to make sure that we were hearing from those groups as well. And just even having them in the room, not having them off in a separate meeting, but it was important to have them in the room so that everybody can see how diverse Seattle is becoming. And that's what we need to keep. That's what we're planning for. We're planning for a much, much more diverse community. By 2035, Seattle will probably be a majority city. So that's what the projections are. So does that help? Somewhat.
I guess a follow-up question would be, and I know that this panel is about community engagement, but to sort of take all of that good intention and good work up front, what do you think are some of the best metrics to use once change has been implemented to know that you've been successful in minimizing displacement and maximizing inclusion?
So that's mean, that's really hard because I don't even know in Austin we struggle to even define gentrification and displacement. So if you can't define something, it's really hard to measure it. We know we have it, and it's on I'd say as our city demographer says, it's on a spectrum of it. Because one example we had is we did our year 5 update and we ran metrics and saw one of them was poverty, and our poverty rate went down. And so we're like, oh, great, patting ourselves on the back and like, well, let's take a look at that. And it's like, oh, wait, no, the reason the poverty rate went down is because people were getting pushed out of the city. So it was, so the indicator was misleading. So, with the indicator, I'll say this: you kind of have to go through it. A lot of things in a comp plan, you won't really see change until maybe 5, even 10 years. So it's tough. And then once you get to that point, you have the result of that metric. Take a step back and think and ask yourself, are we even actually measuring the right thing? And try and figure that out. But it's a wicked problem. It's tough.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing on the measuring and the metrics. As part of our process and part of the work that we do with PolicyLink was we actually developed some maps where we thought the places in our city that were more vulnerable to displacement. And so that is a tool that I know a lot of our departments are using now. And then on the converse side, we had another map that showed where were the areas of highest opportunity. So that sort of pair of maps can be used to, when we do get to implementation or we're designing a program or we're developing affordable housing, those maps and that information is certainly guiding other decisions beyond the comprehensive plan. We did commit. We hoped that we would include indicators in our plan, but we didn't quite get there, and so we are following up and looking at indicators now. And specifically, our council has asked us to develop indicators related to displacement and equity, and so that's one of the things that we're developing at this point.
I think a key point might be looking at zoning and looking at communities of color and how do you zone for them the appropriate way. For example, in San Francisco, 20 years ago, there were downtown San Francisco Chinatown was threatened by development from the big banks. They wanted to make it all corporate, but the Chinese community in San Francisco, they did a zoning code so strong that they outlined every business, how big it should be, every storefront, every height. So they maintained the character and their livelihood in Chinatown. Now it's the way Chinatown in San Francisco looks the same way it looked 20 years ago, because the zoning code is so strong there that it really preserves that community. So I think for people of color, we have to define our own zoning codes. What makes Latino neighborhoods great? How do we put that into code so it's there? But otherwise, if you don't put a value to your community, you can't defend it.
Are we ready for another question?
I was just going to say quickly, I think the metrics are hard, but I do think there's things that we can put into place before we're measuring that helps to not gentrify in the way I think that the lady asking the question and improve. So how do we set up policies? How do we set up agreements with the communities that are there so that wealth is being retained and they're actually benefiting from additional density that might be coming into the neighborhood? And so I think it's just being super intentional. There's a lot of different kind of tools that are out there. How are we really incorporating the folks that are already living in that neighborhood and have forever in the planning and in the wealth generation that's taking place in that community?
So I have 2 questions. One is a follow-up. We talked a lot about measuring, and I'm sure you probably refer to quantitative, like data, like population and demographics. But during the input process, we're talking about storytelling and people's lived experiences. So are those going to be factored into measuring? Have those been factored into any of your plans in terms of measuring the success of the plans? And then my other question is in terms of outreach, you talked a lot about partnering with local organizations. And so when you do outreach, how much do you rely on those organizations to do all of the ground outreach, or do you also do things like, I don't know, bus ads or your own non-tech-based, like non-social media outreach?
Yeah, I think for me, I grew up in East Los Angeles, and when you look at the numbers, it's portrayed as a really bad place. You know, high crime and high unemployment. But I want to tell a different story. What makes this community great, and what's the social cohesion here? So you want to paint the other picture that the numbers don't tell you. And I think that's why storytelling and getting that input is really critical in having a comprehensive look at that neighborhood. If you just look at numbers, they didn't tell you one thing, but you have the residents tell their stories about what makes this neighborhood great and how it works is a different story. So you need a balance of both. The narrative, two different narratives, the numbers, but also the actual lived experiences to understand a place. And I think for me, face-to-face is really important because a lot of people of color, they want to be face-to-face. And a lot of them don't trust government, they don't trust online mechanisms, and you really want to kind of build that kind of empathy between people that they can work together face-to-face and tell their stories, and kind of, because cities are about face-to-face encounters. You walk down the street, you see somebody. So it's really kind of enhancing that whole sense of, of public, collaboration. So for me, face-to-face is really critical as a way to do planning.
What?
Sorry, this is can everyone hear me? This is a question actually for our city planning committee. How do you view your role as a regulator, one of the only entities in the city that regulates, development? Do you look at it as purely you're just looking at, the size and heights of buildings, or the impact that, these new developers are going to be having on the city? And does that factor into your decision, whether to approve something or not?
Well, it's a couple of different ways that this happens, and I'm happy to talk about that. There's a couple of different ways. One is if you actually have a project which already has zoning and it already has its basic, there are actually you look at it through that lens. You look at the lens of bulk, how much floor area can it have, how big can it be, and what its use is. And those are things that are actually written into the zoning code, and that's the core of how we as a department look at it and review it, and how the planning commission reviews it as well. So as you know, sort of more standard projects will just go through a staff review, but the more complex ones will be put before the commission or other commissions that we have, like Historic Review Commission and so forth. What you try to do, though, is ideally, and to some degree that I can give some examples where we feel that we've accomplished this, but we have more to do, which is one of the reasons you do a comprehensive plan, is you want it to be built in to that code, built into that evaluative process, built into those standards, the values that you've arrived at in terms of different of goals, of shared goals for the city. For example, it seems like it's just zoning, but in fact, if a local neighborhood LNC zoning has a sort of relatively modest size, 30, 35 foot high buildings and so forth, and that captures what a local neighborhood wants and has wanted through a process along the way before you created that zoning, then it is built into some degrees. There is always, but no matter how much you work to build that into your zoning, that's something that we've worked to build into the new riverfront zoning. It's something we've worked to build into the Eco-Innovation District. It's something that we've seen built into the values of projects that are, like the Hazelwood Green or others, which may not address everyone's values concerns, but definitely have any number of values that are built into their approach. And so I think that and there is a room for a kind of discretion and a kind of filter of a review, which can be from the perspective of the Planning Commission as it does its deliberations. It can be from the perspective of staff. It can be from the perspective of the community engagement that we expect to happen, certainly on major projects, that when they come to the Planning Commission, we ask them, have you spoken with the community? What community group? Do you have a letter from the community supporting your project and so forth? And all of those things become grist for the mill of the evaluation. The point of a comprehensive plan is to get to some of the work that we've already done and the work that we're in the middle of, is you're really trying to build those values in so that wherever that zoning code is in 5 years from now, you'll have built the values in. There'll still be discretion, there'll still be filters, but at the same time, you try and get some of that into the code itself. And so it's a long answer, but it is a complex question. And I really, I like answering questions, and I will answer some more, but I also want to make sure we get them to the rest of the audience. So, Sylvia, there's a question up here. I don't know if you have a question back there, or who's next?
Just as a follow-up to that question that was just asked, I think it'd actually be great if we could pose that to our panelists. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you've built code or built engagement into your code in your other cities. And then for James and Gabo and Julia, kind of how have you, from your more activist and nonprofit perspectives, kind of advocated for those things to be built into the code and through any other elements you view as impactful?
Small question.
Well, again, a lot of it's how people kind of perceive space, and you could look at a mobility plan or mobility street policies, and I can do workshops with engineers, and they'll just say the sidewalk should be 12 feet, the highway, the street, the lane should be 20 feet. But when you talk to the community, they might say, I need a place to walk with my children that's safe, or I need a place to walk my dog. I need a place to, I want a place that has a lot of good lighting, it's really safe. So it's really kind of combining these two kind of narratives and really combining all the different ways that people understand these spaces, these public spaces, or space in general, really kind of getting that kind of overall approach that everybody has to it. So having a more inclusive process will bring in all these different stories and how people really kind of live their lives in these spaces, and how we can really kind of start looking at policies and zoning as a way to kind of enhance their lives through this process.
And the New York City context, for public review processes for like rezonings and like large new developments that change the underlying zoning, the city does have their public review process that has testifying and like public forums. But how we've worked together, like collaborating really with communities around that, is preempting the process. So before the public review process, a few neighborhoods we work with, they put together their own comprehensive plan around the slew of topics from housing, community health and resources, open space, and all of that, together with us, and sometimes flagging city planning, saying, hey, we're doing this beforehand. So we know that the X kind of park that we want, is this feasible or not? Tell us right now. So we're not coming into this process like surprised. So a lot of our work does that, put together a comprehensive plan first with all of that information, a lot of recommendations, pulling up priorities through a lot of engagement about what is the most important issues for you, and then bringing that to the city before the actual neighborhood process. So city planning, at least in New York City, knows these are what they want. Yeah.
I think maybe just to tag onto that a little bit, I think we're also starting to really pull the city and integrate them into the processes that we're doing in rezonings, for an example, in parallel, in partnership with the community groups. So it's not they're coming to the table at the end, but they're actually coming to the table at the beginning, and they're having participation at every single meeting in conjunction with the steering groups. And so really at the end, they're also equally invested into all the work they put in, not as invested, but they're also invested along with the community. So I think that helps break down some boundaries. And then I think cities in general are getting savvy to engagement. I think it's something that cities are really actively trying to incorporate. And I think the more processes are transparent and kind of like available for the city to participate in, I think they're seeing the value of that and the value add to the way they're publicly received, and then also to the implementation of those plans. So it's kind of a win-win.
Thanks. I'm up here in the front, so don't forget these folks. So.
Okay. Hi. Oh, I don't know if this is on. Oh,
I think it is. Okay, so I'm an urban studies student at Pitt, and a couple of us are. So we talk a lot about gentrification in Pittsburgh, but I'd love to know like specific things that you guys do in your cities to alleviate some of the negative effects of gentrification, whether it be like a specific policy like inclusionary zoning or mixed income housing or something along those lines.
Sure. So the slide I wanted to show the process. I think it was in 2003 we had a resident task force that worked on gentrification and displacement and came up with recommendations. And then last year the mayor created another task force on gentrification, and they're working on recommendations right now. We're also working with the University of Texas. They're coming up with a map to show kind of stuff Patrice was talking about, where areas that are more vulnerable to being displaced and gentrified. I mean, again, just it's a wicked problem. It sucks, and if you look at the tools the cities have to deal with it, we're very limited in what we can do, and that's frustrating as well.
How does, Matt or someone else, just how does the engagement side of the question figure? You mentioned task forces. I mean, have they been able to feel like they got the right input in the way that they did their work, or the right conversation?
I think they feel good about that work and the recommendations they came up with, and then it's just kind of following through and doing what was come up with. One thing I'll say is. One thing I've learned is, to make a decision that doesn't affect change, that's really easy to do. So that's what we see people doing a lot. Do a plan, hire a consultant, do some data, do some outreach, do those things again. Those decisions don't really affect change. To get elected officials to make a decision that does affect change, that is really hard to do. So I think it's up to us, it's up to y'all to kind of give them what they need to be able to make those really tough decisions that do affect change.
And sorry, you should go.
Yeah, I was just going to say we have a big menu of things that we're working on that hopefully will relieve some of the gentrification and some of the displacement that's happening in Seattle. So at the same time we were doing our comprehensive plan, we also had a major effort to do inclusionary zoning in the state of Washington, very strong private property rights. The only way that we could implement that requirement was to give the property owner extra development capacity. So we are still in the process of basically upzoning all of our multifamily zones and mixed-use zones in order to apply that. And that has been another years of work that hopefully will come to fruition in the next year. And there is a long list. There's 60 actions that were identified, and inclusionary zoning was just one. And so look up the housing affordability and livability agenda in Seattle, and you can see what those 60 actions are that the city is moving forward on now, or will be trying to implement in coming years. I think within our comprehensive plan, what we tried to do, a lot of our comprehensive plan under our state growth management framework is there's a certain amount of growth that is estimated for our city, and our plan has to reflect how we distribute that. And so we considered very carefully where those areas that were vulnerable to displacement, what sort of growth would we expect there, and our conclusion was, in conversations with the community, is that maybe there should be a lower expectation for growth in some of those places, realizing that those are going to be places where we need to have affordable housing in place. And so maybe go a little bit, try, if we can, go a little bit slower in those places and go a little bit faster in the places that are places of high opportunity. So that was one way that it kind of got expressed in our planning efforts.
Gentrification, I think, is such a big topic, and ways cities and communities deal with this, I think, is very, very place-based. But one thing that came out of a lot of pushing from council members and a lot of neighborhood advocates, especially New York City is a renter majority city. They passed, I think end of last year, City Council passed a certificate of no harassment law, wherein landowners cannot renovate their units without getting a certificate that they have not harassed any of the tenants. And it's on the landowner to prove that, not the tenants trying to go to the city. It's the landowner trying to prove, did you do this, did you do this, did you do this? And only when they certify that the city will allow, in certain places, it's not implemented in the whole of New York, that a developer can renovate their units, because that's a lot of what's happening in New York City, where landowners are renovating units, pushing people out, charging more money. So that's one part, and that came of a lot of really pushback from housing advocates and neighborhoods from the community.
Well, thank you for coming, 5 of you, to share your expertise and experience, because this is not theoretical. Ray now has to proceed. And one of the earlier discussions was there's 2 groups of people involved in these planning processes. There's like the core group, your steering committee group, and then there's the public that they engage at a month-to-month basis or whatever. My question is very specific. What can you share with Ray, both good things and bad things, about organizing that first group? How do you get that group, first of all, engaged? And how do you make sure that the rest of the community thinks that's a credible group and is representative of who they are?
Well, I can go first. So this is very simple. We didn't have a core group. We used our planning commission. Again, our planning commission is selected very intentionally. They go through race and equity training, similar to the training that staff goes through. They know how we work. They know something about the comprehensive plan, and they're all citizens, and again, very intentional to have some broad representation. So they became our core group, and that was the group that we went to with a lot of technical issues. We did briefings for them throughout the process, and so a lot of our outreach was really focused on other ways that we could reach other stakeholders or the general public. Yeah, because it's a lot of work to assemble a specific group for a project like this, and we kind of went back and forth on how we should do that.
I think the initial meeting should be about empathy. How do you build empathy amongst the groups so that they have a common good and common vision? So once you start planting that seed of empathy, then that kind of spreads. And then people can start to work together if they're empathetic. If they're not, they're going to argue, and it's not going to work. So you need to really build the empathy the first day that people come together, and that common good that they can create together.
Yes, so I think that just takes a lot of work with the folks on that advisory group. We created ours. Our consultants went to council and said, okay, if you want an advisory group, here's what you should do. Make it about 10 to 15 people so they can have a meaningful discussion and dialogue, because that's what council said we want. We want to have these meaningful dialogues and discussions on these hot topics. And so, okay, we're going to get 10 to 15 people, and then we got 30 people. So you can't have a dialogue with 30 people, and then also it's actually not big enough to go out and do outreach and take the draft work products out to their constituents, let them know what's going on, and bring that back. So it's almost like you'd be better off with 8 people or 100 people. but I think I think it's working with those folks and seeing hey, this is what's going to be helpful for us, and let them know up front, and then you have the conversation with them what do you think you could do that would be really helpful to this that maybe we're not seeing, and trying to figure out is there a role somewhere in between that, because we really struggled with what was the role of our task force. And it was interesting with this crazy process with them where they were really difficult to work with. You talk to them one-on-one and they're great, and in the meetings they would just lose their mind and be crazy. And then when we had them vote on stuff, that was really difficult. When our map came out, everybody lost their mind. The whole community went crazy with the map. And then at the end, I think a handful of them kind of got together and you know what, this is pretty cool. This is pretty good. I think I'm a little bit proud of this. And they started getting protective of it. And then they were in charge of these working groups that came up with the actions to implement the policies. And they took over the plan, and they took ownership of it. And they voted like 21-3 to endorse the plan. It knocked our socks off. We couldn't believe it. And then from that point on, they carried it through adoption. And it's kind of like, this is their draft now, get out of the way. So it was kind of very up and down, but at the end, it worked out really well. So you just, I don't know, I guess hang on, maybe.
Just hang on. Okay. Hang on. Write that down. Okay.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. My name is Denise. I am a resident of the Hill District. I'm also a transplant from Cincinnati, where I have worked on public engagement in terms of county planning and for transportation. I've also worked with the Hills community to develop a master plan. And I'm wondering, how do you incorporate the voices of a community that's already established into your long-range planning? Because this community specifically has a very long history of displacement, and the city has a shady credibility. So.
So when Seattle created its first comprehensive plan under the new state law in 1994, that was followed by a period of neighborhood planning. And so there were neighborhood plans that were created for about 30 sub-areas throughout the city, places that were identified in the overall comprehensive plan that would grow. And some of those policies were, and that became a chapter. So we pulled out some of the policies from those plans, from that collection of plans, and we created a neighborhood planning section in our comprehensive plan. As we go and do updates to some of those sub areas, we go back and we amend and we change some of the policies that are in there so that they're more consistent with what the updated neighborhood plan is. Those 30 areas don't only cover about 1/3 of the city, so it's not like we can take those neighborhood plans and sort of patch them together and it creates a whole picture of the city, because there's a lot of areas there where we don't really do planning. We just focus on these places where we think there's going to be change, and that's where our planning has been focused on. So there is, and one thing that we also did in our latest update was we talked a little bit more about community involvement, and we talked about neighborhood planning as a form of community involvement, and actually adopted some guidelines and just some guidance overall, still pretty flexible, because I think our approaches for community and neighborhood planning are always changing based on the current situations, but at least it gives us kind of a little bit of an overview about what the community is expecting from these plans and what the city can deliver from these plans.
I think with the Hill District, I think they have a strong narrative there, a strong story to tell, and you got to keep that story alive. So you have to put the elders front and center of this plan. You tell us your story, and it just gets passed down. And that story becomes part of the basis for the future plan. Because it's all about attachment, but it's also about aspirations. Where do we go from here? But we've got to start from this narrative, because that's rich. And that's where it all kind of starts. But really getting the elders involved, front and center in this whole planning process would be the first step to really define a sense of belonging and of that community, and also how to bring it to the aspirational part.
Yeah, New York doesn't have a history of neighborhood planning, or we don't have a comprehensive plan either. But I think, advocating continuously, like engagement, I'm sure as you know, is an ongoing effort, and making sure that the voices and the thoughts and what you all need in the neighborhood is coming through and all. So it's showing up to meetings, it's being a vocal participant, it's having those conversations when planning is at the table to be able to you know, kind of like a win-win to delegate where new affordable housing should go if it's coming to your neighborhood as opposed to where it shouldn't go. It's just having those like nuanced conversations.
Okay, I guess it's. Okay. Can't hear it. We can hear you. Can you? I received my Master of Urban and Regional Planning, one of the few African American planners in the early 1980s. The 3 points I want to make are, number one, we do have that history of the destruction of the Civic Arena and what that entailed. And I'm sure Mr. Castile remembers a bunch of our comments. It's etched in his mind how we had to fight the Penguins to even get the historical pieces put into their master plan. And we're still trying to figure out how to get something down there. What I want to say, second of all, is we're going through a great socioeconomic shift in our region. There's a lot of new businesses that are going to be built, hospitals, schools, and whatever. Our people, and when I say our people, have been kept out of the process for so long that when our city planners come to any individual district, there's this natural fear and distrust that has to be overcome. And a lot of times I get pulled into different communities because I look like them. And they kind of feel, well, you've had our shared experience. I'm also a native of the Hill District and also of the Public Housing Authority community. So 5 degrees later and 6 majors later, I hope that I've learned enough to be patient with the process. Also, thirdly, we're very, very democratic party here. A lot of our neighbors, white and black, do not want to come out to meetings because they feel somebody's going to call my job and say, you didn't choose my project, and therefore you're going to lose your job. And I know several cases in which that has happened. In your communities, what role does the majority party have in your comprehensive plan process? And how do you tell politicians that what they want and what they want to fund may not be in the best interest of the community at large?
I think, as a planner of color too, I grew up in East Los Angeles, and so planning, most planners grow up in really kind of middle-class suburbs where everything is perfect. The grass is cut perfectly, the houses are all beige, they understand perfection. But for people of color like myself, grew up in these kind of do-it-yourself landscapes, we don't understand perfection. It's not in our vocabulary, so as planners of color, we have to learn this other vocabulary in place. And understand how do we really make planning a lot more fluid and understanding these kind of do-it-yourself landscapes, rather than just having this hard and fast rule between perfect and not perfect. So I think that's one thing that we have to really think about, and we'll go into planning. What kind of backgrounds do we have as planners? I think it's great that you can get out there, and I think I think for your question about how do you change, I think a lot of it is kind of, for me, it's organizing the community outside of planning. If you look at a place like LA, most of the great planning comes from the grassroots. The planners are middle class, they see it as black and white, but yet you have 5,000 street vendors on the street corners in LA every day that they don't see. They're there, but they don't see it because in their middle class world, that doesn't exist. So I think it's up to us as planners of color and other people to really kind of uplift these stories and say, we do exist, these are out there, and we have to really build that narrative. And the only reason why LA just legalized street vending And the only reason why I done that because we got 5,000 illegal street vendors was because of Trump. If we would have, they would have all been sent back to Mexico if they would have had a misdemeanor, right? So we just said, okay, you're legal. Now we got to figure out how to do the policy to really kind of do the zoning for them. But again, it's really thinking about how do you create that alternative story that's coming up from the community to really get the politicians' attention. So that's one way of doing it.
So we have a strong mayor form of government. So that means I work in all of the departments. We work for the mayor. We prepare proposals. Sometimes we certainly want to highlight when we think what the risks are. We also, as part of it, we do very technical impact analysis. You know, this big, very not very easy to understand environmental process that we're required to do by state law that you know, identifies the traffic impacts. Even when we're not building a particular project, but even when we're changing a policy, we have to go through this process. And that information, it does like lay out usually some alternatives, and we could do this or we could do that. And through the community input that we get, sometimes we have to go back and we have to add another alternative because the community said, no, you should have looked at this pattern of growth too. So there is a lot of information, but at the end of the day, it is a political statement. The mayor has to be comfortable with that plan and send that plan to council to be adopted. So that's why it's important not just for us planners to do all the technical work and try and bring that information forward, and here's what the community said and here's what our technical consultants are saying, but it's also important as the plan, you know, goes through that process and council deliberates and they make changes. So it is really critical for the people who have the wherewithal to kind of stay with us and take it through that legislative process, because a lot of times that's when the significant decisions kind of get made. So hang in there. Did we say Ray has to hang on? You guys have to hang on too.
So I serve on the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, which upholds civil rights in the city of Pittsburgh, and on the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Task Force. And what many people don't understand is that nationally, and certainly here in Pittsburgh, government imposed segregation through zoning, through building highways, through people's neighborhoods, through forcing people out of their homes, exclusionary zoning. So we in government have a responsibility to repair the harm. And again, you know, there are environmental impact studies for zoning. We have a fair housing obligation to look at how our zoning and our planning affects those who are called the protected classes, but they are not protected. So yes, those stories are so critical. But do you know how many people have been displaced from this city, and it's so hard to make it to a community meeting? They have to take a bus and transfer 2 or 3 times, and if they don't have a bus card, they're paying $275 for each transfer. So a one-way trip can be at the minimum $7 to $15, depending on where they're coming from. So I work with Pittsburghers for Public Transit out in the Mon Valley, and I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that have been displaced, and they can't come to a meeting to tell their stories because they're working 2 or 3 jobs trying to survive. They don't have the access to food, to schools, to jobs. There is so much harm going on when we know the policies that would prevent harm. How many times has inclusionary zoning been recommended again and again and again? How many times has basic fair housing criteria been advanced to show, I mean, with the Penn Plaza displacement, that's a tiny tip of the iceberg, right? So many people across the city are being displaced in the same ways. And when the Planning Commission was looking at social impact, they didn't look at food access or access to public transit or health care. And what results is death. I mean, seriously, people are dying of this problem. Out in the Mon Valley, we have some of the highest infant mortality rates in the country. So we have studied and studied and studied. You know, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Task Force is about to bring out these policies out into the community for feedback, but so many of them have been recommended so many times. We have got to do something.
Just questions?
All right. How's everybody doing? Sweet. Hey, Christine. So I had a quick question. My concern is that the people that need to hear this are not in this room. And so I've been a part of a lot of community planning processes, those that have been successful, those that have not. Some in Larmer that was very successful with the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative. And it seems like the city is gonna create this thing, to do this thing that communities are already doing. People in their communities rally around the fact that their community is in that shape. They rally around the fact that they have diversity, they have integrity and faith in their history, and they want to maintain that. They have empathy, all the things that you guys are saying. But how is that? And additionally, we hear, you know, all the neighborhoods need the same thing: green space, they need housing, they need food, they need education, they need access. It's all uniform. So how is all of that informing what the city is doing? How is that informing treasurer sales and T sales to be shorter, not take 24 months, or maybe the side lot program is more than just a side lot program. Maybe we can actually start owning property. How are these things starting to inform what the city is doing instead of creating this facet of engagement that already is happening in these neighborhoods? So the people in this room need to be informing the work of the city and not the other way around. You can tell us to spread empathy and all that, but we have that. These neighborhoods have been in disarray. The Hill has witnessed displacement and gentrification. We all come together and collaborate around this terrible thing. So how is that enforcing or informing what the cities now need to do? I just need to know, because the people you're talking to in this room are not the people you need to be talking to. So.
Well, I think that we can answer this. I think that it'd be great to hear some from the panelists as well. I do. Okay. How about this? Yes. I'm going to shout.
Stand in the middle.
Hello? There we go. So, one of the ideas of this is, again, we have that's why we've got this working group. That's why we're going to keep working on this. We're not, getting these ideas and this sort of examples from other cities is something that I think is very useful. I think it builds on a lot of work. I think everybody has something to learn about engagement one way or another, especially I know that I do, and I've been at it for a long time. But I know that I know a great deal more to learn, and I also know that I can learn. But we put a lot of energy into learning from the community in Pittsburgh, and that's why this working group is all Pittsburghers. That's why we work very hard to have a composition of that group to make sure that we're hearing about the voices from folks that have done all different types of planning work. And when you talk about learning from where you live, you have to take that into account. And that's, none of this is to set up a screen that keeps us from hearing the work that's already been done, whether it's in Larmer or any number of other communities. What we're trying to do is make sure that those plans that the work that's already been done, building on that, the work that groups have already created, the community groups we actually have we know we have a robust civic culture in this town. There are a lot of groups, there are a lot of nonprofits, and they are part of the discussion. They are part of how the city makes a decision. That's why we, engage groups like that in something like the advisory group that is for the Housing Opportunity Fund, for example, which has worked very hard to make sure we're hearing a range of voices from people that have the on-the-ground experience of housing needs in that committee. And so that is part of how we do the work, and that's part of how we intend to work with this working group that's on public engagement. We're not inventing an entirely new process. People have been talking to each other about how to make their cities better for thousands of years. And the question is, what can we do? And when we think about a comprehensive plan where we start talking about the systems in the city, transportation systems, housing systems, et cetera, how can we make sure that that kind of knowledge and that experience gets into that so that we don't end up putting a layer of comprehensive planning that hasn't been informed by the neighborhoods, hasn't been informed by groups that have found their own way to empathy and their own way to communication and their own way to empowerment and putting themselves in the position to partners for creating a civic document. So that's what we're doing. This is not about not hearing people or not listening to people. Having this panel, and doesn't take away our responsibility from working with communities, working with the people who've been doing with this, listening to them. That's much of what they're here is just to remind us of that obligation, part of their own experience, that these are like, when cities try and do this, there's actually lessons to learn from each other. When you try and use these tools about how you turn this into ordinance, how you turn this into a policy, how you turn this into capital investment, how do you do that in a way that has a real partnership model? And there are lessons to be learned from these different experiences. But again, we have to take what's gone on here, and what has gone on here, as you say, this is a city of incredible stories and incredible communities. That's one of the things that makes it so powerful and such a very unique, it is actually in many ways unique in the density of community and unique in the sort of almost the range of community that this 55 square miles has. So with that, if you guys had any other comments that were not sort of about, just how when you've come in and we've been doing a sort of planning process, beyond just sort of noting the trusted advocates model, but also how have you made sure that you connected to the work that had already been done? I mean, you mentioned, for example, that there were communities where it felt they'd been planned to death, that was sort of, and that was part of the sort of healing of that to get beyond that. Maybe you could talk about that.
I mean, I think it's acknowledging and really recognizing the work that's already been done. So the multiple plans, the multiple time and energy that have been put to communities already kind of taking a stand and identifying what they want and where they want it in their communities. So I think going in for a comprehensive planning process, it's first taking the time to assess, to categorize, to understand what those planning efforts were, to really go back, understand what the community was saying, reach out to people that were a part of those processes in the past, have conversations and dialogue that helps ground that before going into communities at ground zero, right? And so how can you kind of take all that work and elevate and push it to the next level in the context of the larger city, and how does that neighborhood plan fit into the larger city and the efforts that Pittsburgh is trying to do? Yeah, so I think it's just taking that moment.
We had Sophie, we have time for 2 more questions.
This young lady over here.
So we'll go there, and then so you, and then you. That'll be 2. Okay.
You've talked about the working group, but I was just it's kind of a two-sided question. Number one, who's on the working group, and how are they chosen? And what standards, for the public engagement policy that you guys are working on, what standards are you going to give us by which we can hold you guys accountable to it?
Well, we sent out and got a lot of responses, a lot of folks that wanted to be on the working group, and we did a selection trying to make sure that we've got a great range of geography, background, and so forth. And I think we feel that we've done that. And then the group is going to, they're working to prepare, sort of essentially get to a draft framework. And that draft framework says, this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to try and use technology. This is how we're going to use meetings. This is how we're going to go to where people are. All this, sort of establish those kind of standards. And I think we, the stuff that comes to us and to that group is all grist for the mill. I mean, it's not like we're doing that in the void. So, and then we'll put out that draft, and that creates a discussion where, that framework becomes, we ultimately sign off on it. This is the framework if we're going forward. And the way to be accountable is really just, it's a filter. We'll set up our meetings for the mobility, questions of mobility, let's say. And it's like, well, that's like a filter to look at how we're doing it. Okay, what are we doing on the technology side? What are we doing on the geographic range side? What are we doing about getting from 8 to 80 so we don't have just sort of people in kind of age 30 who's our only respondent or whatever, so we get beyond even just an age demographic. So that's what will be out there after a couple of meetings, a couple of sort of brainstorming, and then we'll come out with that and we'll get that response.
Is there a way to know, like if someone from your neighborhood, like say the Hill District or our neighborhood, Beachview, if we wanted to know who was representing us in this group, if anyone, how would we be able to know?
I don't know. I mean, we could. The list is public. Is it out with the list yet? I mean, it's not pre-answered. So.
Yeah. So we're going to be putting the list of the members of the working group online just in the next few days. The working group will meet once per month. Over the next 3 months, they'll have a meeting in October, November, and December. All the meeting minutes for all of those meetings will be published online. And then in early 2019, we'll have a draft of the public engagement plan that we'll come back to the larger community with and seek more review. Also on your exit surveys, there's which I would encourage all of you to please fill out. There's a tab at the bottom that says, would you like to be involved in the review of this plan, and would you like to be further involved in general in this process? And so those are 2 avenues where if you click those, then give us your email address. We'll be sure to engage you in all, put you on our listserv for all this work.
Great. Thank you. And we have one more question.
Yeah, so I just wanted to take her question and I guess just pose it to the panel very quickly. So kind of what are things that you have seen in your respective cities that have been put into code that the community can use to advocate for their needs and for better engagement?
Yeah. So yeah, we did. We actually, one of the changes to our comprehensive plan that came out of our community engagement was we added another chapter that was called community involvement. And again, it laid out those principles. It laid out sort of the city's commitment to have inclusive community engagement. And again, it's not going to be like this plan telling you exactly what the phases are and what kinds of things you're going to do. So that was one outcome that came out of our process. And then also we have a Department of Neighborhoods, and they have been sort of charged with being a resource for all of the city's work. And so that was, we kind of beefed up their responsibility in terms of guiding all of the city's community engagement. And that is still evolving. But again, some of the things that are coming out of that work is really sharing that information across departments. If Matt has a meeting with some communities talking about, mobility, like, hey, could you share that with us? Because we are also going to be doing some work. So sharing out that knowledge, and then again, recognizing what people have told us before and sort of being prepared to report on that and what's going to happen and what the next steps are. So those are just some of the things that we're trying to move forward on and advance in Seattle.
Thank you. One more question.
Actually, it's not a question. Can you hear me? In the 70s and the 80s, a lot of the neighborhoods sort of did their own master plans. I know Lawrenceville did their own master plan. And we paid somebody to put it together, and we put it together, and then years later we had the Lola plan for the lower Lawrenceville. And those plans just got disregarded from the city. We had put all our work into doing that and to looking to see across the board what people needed, how we would get it, and how we would envision our neighborhood. And it kind of got lost. and I just want to know what happened.
Well, a couple of things. One, we have copies of all those plans. We have those plans, and as you know, Councilwoman Gross has every plan in her district as well, and keeps us very informed about them when we don't recall them. It's also, as you know, it's become they're a tool which is used by the community organizations like the Lawrenceville Development and Lawrenceville United. They use them as a reference point. So, and when I look at when the development, when projects come in, there's still a reference point, whether in the community process. Now,
Very slim.
but this is why we've been working to develop in like neighborhood plans, which will be actually concretized and passed. So those plans were never passed.
That's right.
And what we
were told to stop.
well, and on that one I can say I wasn't there, but I speaking for the city, I recognize your concern, but what we're trying to do now is like we actually, in the work that we were able to do with the Eco Uptown District, that's actually those guidelines, and when a project comes through, those guidelines are a key reference points. Some of them are actually zoning that became not just a plan, but became like this is the new zoning. Other ones are more guidelines closer to what was produced in the Lola plan and so forth. And so, and in the build out of Lola, Lower Lawrenceville, some of the recent projects actually do accord with it in many ways. But that said, we're trying to make this more, have a more, build it into, when we talked about how we build into code, we're trying to get the neighborhood plans, and we expect to be moving through neighborhood plans over the next few years, both new ones and the ones that we can sort of recontextualize into, make them so that the City Planning Commission considers them. Because there is language in our code that says you shall consider approved neighborhood plans. We haven't had approved neighborhood plans, which is why we're institutionalizing a way to approve them. So we are moving on that. And so with that, I'm going to thank you all. Appreciate it. There were a lot of some hard conversations here, which we recognize, and we recognize the concerns. That's why we're doing this work. It's not besides that. So I want to thank the speakers again for your work and for your comments. Thank you very much for being here and for. Since you are not, and I would like to give you I'm going to speak for the room. Welcome to Pittsburgh. Come back. And then this is a very welcoming city. It's a complicated city, but it's a very welcoming city, as I've experienced personally, and I appreciate it from the folks here. So I'd also like to note that Yvette Mangala is working with us now, and we'll be working with the group as well. Again, thanks to the Children's Museum, thanks to Sophie Robeson and Anna McCrae, as well as Assistant Director Dash for the work that they've done for this event, and mostly thank you to the audience for being here and participating. Thank you very much.